the interview at Pregame HQ or wherever in the cloud Pregame is this week. I'm Ciara Pressler, and this is where I interview some of my favorite creators, innovators, game changers, and bring their wisdom to you. And today we have a king of creators of sorts. I'm so excited to welcome my friend Jeff, or as he's known professionally, B. Jeffrey Madoff. He is the author of Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas. This book is just out this year. What a strange year in 2020 to release a book. We'll hear more about that. But this book is based on a seminar that he teaches at Parsons, the new school. And it's for senior fashion designers. And they get this amazing opportunity to learn from all of these pros in creativity from across all different industries. And he has distilled years of interviewing all these people into this book, and it is perfect. It is correct. You must get it. But we will hear from him about the journey creating the book and about what he's learned from decades of working with some of the top creators in the US and beyond. So welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Ciara. Nice to see you.
It's great to see you too. It's weird to see you from 3,000 miles apart, but this is how we're doing it these days.
Yeah, and I think maybe somebody's microphone not muted or something, so there was big feedback. I thought Jimi Hendrix was showing up there for a second.
Oh, that would be nice, but we should be okay for now.
Okay. So I'm sorry, what was the question?
So what has it been like releasing this book this year? You said you've been doing a lot of Zoom interviews, whereas they might be in person normally.
Well, it's been interesting. You know, when COVID first hit, I called my editor at Hachette and said, do we want to postpone the launch of the book? The book was launching June 16th. And he said, no, you know, people are home, they're reading. So I would say that we should not change the date. So I didn't know if it was going to be the best time or the worst time to launch a book. But one of the things that happened is, I think as a result of this, people are reflecting on those who are working, figuring out, do they want to continue what they're doing? Do they want to go in a new direction? Do they want to start a new business? You know, I think there's a lot of self-reflection going on at this point. And the book speaks to that. And there's also that whole graduating class, the first graduating class that had a virtual graduation. So they'll be able to tell their children and their children's children about how weird their senior graduation from college was. So I'm hoping it's a good time to be promoting a book. And yes, I have been doing a lot of podcasts and radio interviews, all of it like this, actually.
Yeah, it is a good time for self-reflection. I think a lot of people are rethinking college itself. Do I stay in college? What's the value proposition of a university right now, especially if it's not in person? But then, you know, beyond that, careers, especially those who are in education and hospitality, you know, the industries that have been harder hit, and everybody has that creative spark somewhere. And so I do think it's a really timely book.
Thank you. That's certainly what I'm hoping. And, you know, it's interesting when you said that everybody has that creative spark somewhere, because so often you'll hear people say, well, I'm not really creative. Or somebody who is in business saying they're not creative, somebody who is creative saying, you know, I can't do business. And people sort of eliminate themselves out of categories. And I think that that's a big mistake, because I think that you're right. Everybody's kind of born with that spark of creativity, but it often gets squashed out pretty early on in life.
So how do you define a creative career?
Well, I think I'll take a step back and first say, how do we define creativity? And I think that creativity is a compelling need to bring about a change. And that can be on a blank canvas, or that could be a business idea that you want to actualize into your career. So I think that the definition of creativity needs to be broadened, because creativity is really about making a change. And an entrepreneur starts with an idea, just like a painter does, just like a writer does. And that idea, through their talent, their perseverance, through all of the things it takes to do any career, is able to create a job and a career out of that. So I think that entrepreneurs aren't often looked at as artists, but they start with nothing but an idea and they give birth to something else.
Yeah, and cultivating that and continuing to explore that and push, is so interesting. I think about the artists who have a lot of success right out of the gate, or any of us in our careers who have success out of the gate. Do you keep producing the same thing, or do you keep pushing yourself creatively? I think in the book you talk about disappointment at a concert of hearing an artist's new stuff that sounded just like their old stuff, and you thought, wow, what a missed opportunity to continue developing creatively.
Yeah, I think, it was actually, you're referring to a James Taylor concert, and I love James Taylor. And it was filled with all these people, of my generation and some younger. And he said, I'm going to sing some new songs. And the audience let out an audible groan. And I thought, oh man, this guy's so talented. Just let him do whatever he wants. And so when he heard the groan, and he's very sharp and he's very funny, he said, oh, don't worry, it sounds just like my old songs. And so I thought that was really actually kind of sad. It depressed me, because if you're a fan of an artist, then you go with what the artist does. Doesn't mean you like everything, but you realize that that's all part of a journey. And that journey can encompass many iterations on a style, like, Picasso and his different periods. And there are musicians that did that too, and James Taylor was one of them. So oftentimes it's interesting that the question that you brought up is, do you keep doing the same thing or change? So much of that depends on why you're doing what you're doing, and also the fear of risking losing the market that you already have if you did something different. So there's a lot of things that come into play on that.
Well, you are an expert on brand, and I think that's where we hesitate, is if we are establishing a brand with what we create, we want to stay on brand with our creation because now it's our livelihood. How do we stay on brand and yet continue to be creative and curious?
Well, I think, we see that. You can look at a number of examples. So if you look at Tina Fey, she started off doing stand-up and improv. Then she did sketch comedy on Saturday Night Live. Then she became a writer. Then she became an actress, and she became a producer. So, she was able to do all of those different things, which are just different facets of her personality and her talent. Like Melissa McCarthy, who started off doing stand-up, and then I saw the movie, I forget the name of it, but she did a movie based on this female author.
Right.
And it's a very dark movie. And she was fantastic. I mean, she can really act. It's just not her comedic stuff, which she does so well. And so the risk she took, I mean, financially, she's fine, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about that. But the creative risk she took is that those people to go see her movies so they will laugh weren't going to laugh at that movie. And so does that lose you part of your following? Or do you allow an artist whose work you like to explore other areas and go on that journey with them? So my tendency is to change it up and to give them a reason to keep coming back. But also there's the personal notion of, if you're curious and if you're in the arts at all, you want to explore things and you want to try different things. So I think that, that does become a business creative career kind of question. But I think that, a brand is a little bit different, because if you're Ralph Lauren, you're not going to do torn leather clothes with safety pins holding them together. You're going to be elegant. You're going to have status and good taste in terms of your brand. And so a brand is a little bit different, but one could argue that Melissa McCarthy has her own brand and Tina Fey has her own brand. But I think that there's room for iteration within that.
Yeah, and my work in the performing arts entertainment industry, and I'm a former performer, which is how you and I met, because I got to be a guest in your class when I wrote my first book, Exit Stage Right, about career transition from performing to something else. You know, there's this notion of get traction doing the one thing that you do or you're known for, or that kind of brand piece, you know, be Robert De Niro and play the gangster for years until you get traction and money, and then you branch out. You know, but it's a matter of finding that thing that you can get traction with too.
Well, you're right. You're right. And you know, it's also interesting because I was talking to somebody recently and they were talking about actors actually and writers. Those were the two groups that they dealt with in their business. And they were talking about how people had a reluctance to sell out.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what do you mean by sell out? Does that mean if you are an actress and when you're starting off in your career, you are a waitress because you only want to do this kind of role, so you're not going to sell out and compromise yourself? Well, actors should act, musicians should play music, painters should paint. And so I think it's not selling out when you try to do something so you can support yourself doing what you love doing.
Yeah, you know, I think sometimes the fear of selling out can actually be a manifestation of imposter syndrome, which you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
You know, I see people in my work with entrepreneurs and self-employed people, solopreneurs, people who are so idealistic about the kinds of customer they want to work with, their ideal client. They become so idealistic about it that they work themselves into this corner where there's no one who's good enough to be their client. And at some point, like, you're helping your client move forward, so they're not going to be where you want them to go yet. You're the tool to help them move to that place. And so I wonder if it's a creative way of preventing yourself from taking risks.
I don't know if it's creative, but I think it's a rationalization.
Yeah.
I remember back when I was in college and there was a group of us talking and, you know, we all had certain artistic aspirations. And one of the people wanted to be a writer. And he said, well, I wouldn't write a bestseller. And I said, what do you mean you wouldn't write a bestseller? Well, I wouldn't want to sell out like that. And I said, well, first of all, there's another reason that you wouldn't write a bestseller. He said, what's that? And I said, because you probably couldn't. Do you know how hard it is to write a bestseller? That's not easy. You may not like the work of a certain author who is a best-selling author, and there are certainly best-selling authors who are also great writers. But, you know, I think it does play into that imposter syndrome that you were referring to. And I think that also people are really reluctant to take a risk and hang their hat on something that may not work out. But the only way that you know whether it's going to work out or not is to take that risk and try it.
Yeah, it takes a tremendous amount of courage. And you talk about that as well in the book, that, you know, especially people who are professional artists, performers, you know, they are the original entrepreneurs because they are testing ideas all the time.
Right. Right. You know, I think of comedians again, you know, the Roy Wood Jr., who was the Black correspondent, senior Black correspondent for The Daily Show and a stand-up comic, who's in the book, who is terrific, just a terrific person and really interesting what he talks about. And a more recent guest, Eliza Schlesinger, who is a very, very successful stand-up comic, and she's wonderful. And we talk about when you're a comedian, your test markets your audience every time you go out there and perform. So both of them, before they would do their Netflix specials, they would go to small clubs and they would work out their material. And what was interesting about it is, you know, you get immediate feedback. People laugh or they don't, you know, and you can't explain, well, you should have laughed at that. This was a funny joke. That doesn't work. You know, so you're a great comedian is pivoting all the time, because if something doesn't work, a really great comedian will do a pivot and get you to laugh at the recovery. But you're getting immediate feedback. So if you look at a joke as your product, laughter is the acceptance of that product, right? So it's really interesting. So performers, especially live performers, and I think that's why I'm so drawn to live performance, is you're flying without a net. and that you are at risk the entire time you're on the stage. And there are certain aspects of that, like being a comedian, you're even more at risk because you're getting that kind of feedback of either laughter or silence throughout the entire set that you're doing, as opposed to a singer that even out of politeness, people will applaud after the song is over. So you're right, that performance and putting it out there in front of people is a really interesting dynamic, and it's very much like proof of concept for a business.
It really is. I talk about how having a background in the arts can be such an asset to moving into a different career industry. But this is another element of that I hadn't thought of yet. All the things that are trendy concepts now, like MVP and the lean startup, like those are things you're just inherently doing on a daily basis as a creator, as an artist. Yeah.
Yeah, and trying to seek opportunities to get your stuff out there, and in the beginning, unless you're independently wealthy, saying no to everything is not a very good idea.
Right.
Because how are you ever going to get traction going if you don't get out there a lot? I'm doing as many podcasts as I can. And do I know the size of the podcast? In most cases, no, I don't. Do I know the person? I mean, you and I are old friends, but normally do I? No, I don't. Am I in a position to turn things down? No, because you never know who's listening. You never know who's going to see it. And you never know what might help you along or what contact may be established or who might reach out. So you put yourself out there. It's not always comfortable, but the sure way to make sure that nothing happens is do nothing. So I think you have to put yourself at risk.
I'm impressed that you say that, and the humility with which you go about your career and promoting the book and connecting with people, because you have collaborated with and interviewed the A+ list of creativity. So I just want to compliment that, because I think that's something that keeps you in that creative space.
Well, thank you. I think that, well, as an interviewer, and it was funny before you let people on, it's you were talking about how it's fun for you to turn the tables on me because I'm usually doing the interviewing, and now you're interviewing me. And I guess turnabout's fair play because I interviewed you about your book. So I'm waiting for the real hammers to come out, but I don't see you that way. But no, I think that probably one of the largest myths out there about entrepreneurship is that it's somehow this rocket ship to fame and money. And I'm sure all of the people that work with you and all entrepreneurs who are honest with themselves, no matter what the size of their businesses is, it's a struggle. It's hard. These things don't happen easily. And I think that the main attribute in terms of personality that an entrepreneur needs to have is perseverance, because it's tough. Starting a business, that's pretty easy. Building it, less easy. Sustaining it and growing it, really hard. And, that's a constant with any kind of entrepreneurship venture. And I think that if people were more honest with each other, if people acknowledged the struggles that they were having, they could possibly help each other and learn from each other's struggles. And which is part of what happens in my class, because I get people talking about that. Because there's so much sort of phoniness out there that's put out on social media of leading this perfect life and how everything is going great. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur because I'm unemployable.
Yeah.
So, I don't know the asset to that. But, my mom and dad were entrepreneurs. My sister owns her own business. So it was kind of in our family to just, be that way, and be more independent. But it's a hard road. And I think that one of the most important things is to ask yourself two really important questions. Is number one, what is it you want to do? And number two, why do you want to do it? Because, the play that I'm doing, if I knew how long it was going to take to mount a play, I would have started when I was a lot younger. You know, it takes a long time, but I have the perseverance because I am motivated by the subject matter, the story that I'm telling, and, you know, that keeps me at it. And, you know, I knew nothing about theater when I wrote this play. I know how to write, but I never wrote a play before either. But I felt that this was a story worth telling. And that has been reinforced over the years that I've been doing that. And now we've got our commercial opening happening in May. But it's hard. And unless you know why you're doing something, and sometimes you have to remind yourself because it does get so difficult, I think it's going to be set you up for lots of frustration. And you're going to have enough frustration anyhow. So you don't need to add your own on top of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I started Pregame, my current business, because entrepreneurs and people who I would call intrapreneurs, people who are responsible for their own results and creativity within a company. You know, so many of the stories of success leave out the hard part. And I was like, we need a safe space where we can talk about the hard parts in a productive way, in an optimistic way. But you know, there's so much reality that's left out, and then people think, oh, I'm not doing it right, because they don't hear the real stories, when in fact things like doubt and imposter syndrome are doing it right, because they're just inherently part of the journey.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, I find the word, I hope I don't offend any of your viewers, but I find the word entrepreneur kind of interesting because, you know, a friend of mine is a CEO of a public company. He is really successful, and I would certainly change bank accounts with him in a nanosecond. And we've been friends since college. He's a wonderful person. And so he was telling me, you know, well, I really respect what you do because, you know, you did this all yourself and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, you're running a multi-billion-dollar company. You are making a fortune doing what you're doing, you know? And he said, yeah, but I don't have to worry about paying the rent. I don't have to worry about paying the lawyers. I don't have to worry about paying the accountant. I don't have to worry about anything but doing my job well. So, you know, it was really interesting because as he was peeling back the layers, said, so I have a lot of support in executing what I want to do. And he does what he does really well, and he's well compensated for it, as he should be, because he makes the company a lot of money. But there is a whole structure that's there. And so it's kind of like when people don't have kids and they say, well, I don't have kids, but I'm so close with my niece. It's like having my own child. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. When you're a parent 24/7, that's what it means to have a child, not when you really like the kid and you spend some time with them once in a while.
That's a good analogy.
Pardon?
It's a good analogy.
And it's the same thing with the business. When you're an entrepreneur, you've assumed all the risk. Nobody has given you a platform from which to operate where you're getting your paycheck every week. Because I've certainly had weeks and months where I haven't had a paycheck, and I've had other times when I've prospered. So, you know, it's that up and down roller coaster ride that happens when you're an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur only has to worry about holding on to their job, but they aren't at risk for anything in the same way at all.
Well, I want to give everyone some context about your own creative journey, because I think you've had a fascinating career path, and now we're adding playwright to the next chapter. And then I'll also open for questions, but you started out in fashion.
Right. Yeah. By accident. That's right.
So tell us more about your beginnings and getting up to the time when you started this creative career seminar.
In the beginning. Well, what happened is, you know, I graduated from University of Wisconsin. I had a double major, philosophy and psychology. And I had also been on the wrestling team. So that combination was, you know, a winning boatload of talent for any career I was going to pursue. Wanted to get a job as a sage, but all the wisdom factories were not hiring at that point. And I was working at this little boutique in Madison where I worked while I was in college. And a friend of mine called me up, and he had graduated from school a year before me. And he said, I saved up some money. Can you think of a gig that would earn more than bank interest? I said, sure. I'll start a clothing company. I said, okay. And I could always draw. I knew what sold in the store. And it was a very funky little boutique. You know, we sold rolling papers and hash pipes at the checkout counter. So it was that kind of a place. And I was ignorant, but fortunately not stupid. So ignorant means you can learn, stupid's forever. And so when I started the business, you know, it started growing really fast. You know, I sketched the clothes. I was so naive that when I saw bolts of fabric in a store, I thought that was wholesale because it hadn't been made into anything yet. So I was really operating from a deficit of knowledge. But there's nothing that's going to wise you up faster than just throwing yourself into the fray and seeing what happens. You know, so I took a shirt that I really liked and cut it apart so I could see that puzzle that made a shirt or a jacket or whatever, and started just getting a sense of construction, and got some of the people that did alterations for the store to make my samples based on the drawings and the fabrics I picked. And we put them in the store. They sold out immediately. Put them back in the store, they sold out immediately again. So what did that give me? Proof of concept. So I then packed my samples, I had a sample line put together, into a small suitcase, strapped it on the back of my motorcycle, and drove from Madison to Chicago to sell to boutiques. And I sold 15 out of 18 stores that I went to, and I'm rolling along. And then I had a really big question, which was, okay, I now have like $55,000 worth of sales. And that was a lot back then. This is the early 70s. And I didn't know how I was going to get it made, you know? So as I was shopping for fabric in the Chicago market, that's one of the questions, one of the sales, a lot of salesmen, by the way, wanted nothing to do with me. At that point I had hair and it was like, you're a Ciara. And, you know, so I was just some kid. And back then, kids were not taken seriously in business. There weren't kids doing startups at that point. But I met a really nice man, and he said to me, so do you have a contractor? And I said, well, maybe. What's a contractor? You know, I had no idea. And he said, do you have anybody to make your clothing? And I said, no. And so he said, wait a minute. He goes over to his Rolodex and he says, listen, I'm going to put you in touch with somebody. You ought to meet this guy. He can help you out. I ship a lot of goods to him, a lot of fabrics to him, because he makes for a lot of the dress companies in the Midwest. And I met this guy, and he was the first person that started making my clothes. And he was in a small town called Montello, Wisconsin. And he was waiting on the front porch of his factory, cigarette hanging from his lower lip. And he says to me, okay, did you bring your stuff with you? I said, yeah. And he was surprised by the way I looked because of my hair and the motorcycle and all that. And we go into his factory. I open the suitcase and I start taking the stuff out of the suitcase. And he goes, this is the shit you sold? I said, yeah. He said, this is what people bought and you got all these orders? I said, yeah. He said, well, with me making it, you're going to be a millionaire. And he became my first contractor, and a really wonderful man who I learned a lot from. But there came a point, my business was doubling every 3 months. So within a year and a half, I had 120 employees. I had an office in New York. I had an office in Los Angeles. I had an office in Chicago. I had national sales reps. And where at first New York intimidated me because I just come for short buying trips. The more I came to New York, the more I wanted to live there. And I told my financial backer, because I had by that time gotten very substantial financial backing. I could have never grown the business without it. And he owned 5 banks in Wisconsin. And he said, you know, the reason that I invested in you is because your employees bank at my bank. If you move out of Wisconsin and you start doing this somewhere else, I have no reason to back you anymore.
Wow.
And he was clear on that from the beginning. So I understood. So I was faced with a huge decision, which is, what do I do? Do I continue in Wisconsin where I no longer wanted to live? Or do I give everything up, shut down the business, and start over again? And people said to me, so do you have a job lined up in New York? And I said, no. Do you know people in New York? I said, no. Do you have a place to live? No. And I said, aren't you afraid of what's going to happen if you go there? And I said, actually, I'm afraid of what would happen if I stayed here. And so I took that risk, and that risk happened back in 1974 or something like that. And now I've lived in New York way longer than I've lived any place else. I love being here. I've never for a second regretted the decision, but I had to start over again. But the one thing that I had realized, there were two important lessons that came from that. One is that time and money, we hear the time is money. Well, money is a two-way street. It comes, it goes, it comes, it goes. Time only goes. And you can't recover lost time. And it's kind of an interesting when you think of the linguistics around it. You spend time, you save time. You spend money, you save money. You're living on borrowed time. It's all of that. And I decided to take that risk, which I'm very happy that I did in order to move my life forward. And the other thing that I learned is that everything that I do informs everything else I do. So going from an idea to a sketch to costing out materials and labor, figuring out how long it'll take, selling it, billing, collecting the money, that's the same thing as making a film. It's the same thing as doing a play. There's the cost of labor, the cost of time, the cost of materials, getting it to whoever has bought it at a price that allows you to keep doing it again. And so I learned that, and those two things have informed everything I've done ever since.
So you're a storyteller, and one of your chapters of creativity has been filmmaking, but filmmaking in the context of some really major brands that we all know, Ralph Lauren, Victoria's Secret. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. The thing about working with major brands is if you think that you're going to revolutionize what they do with your massive creativity, you're wrong. Ralph Lauren has a brand, and he's got millions and millions of dollars invested in that brand, and that brand connotates status and good taste. And if anything is off that compass point, it doesn't make it into what he presents to the public. So it's really important when you work with big brands or like Victoria's Secret, or Donna Karan or any number of them that I've worked with, you have to understand the world that you're inhabiting with them. What does their brand stand for? And then once you realize what that is, then you've sort of established the boundaries of that playground. When you've proven yourself and you deliver on what you do, then you've got their ear and have hopefully gained their trust. And maybe you can push some of those boundaries in some ways, but it's really important to understand the world that that brand lives in, and you need to be within that perimeter in order to thrive. And, Ralph has been a client for 36 years. Victoria's Secret was a client for 26 years. So I also never took their business for granted. I always knew that I had to contribute something of value, and that I should never assume they're going to hire me the next time just because they hired me this time. So you always have to keep delivering value all the time and doing it.
How did the creative careers class come about at Parsons?
So I was directing the Ralph Lauren show, shooting the Ralph Lauren fashion show, and a man, and this is confusing, a guy came up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Dean Stadel, and I'm at Parsons, the new school in New York City." I said, "Oh, you're the dean?" He said, "No, my name is Dean." So anyhow, he taught a class there, and he asked me if I would be a guest speaker in his class. So I did. I had a good time. The students responded well, and he invited me back every semester for like the next 3 years. And then there was an opening that was happening. And he said to me, "There's an opening for an adjunct professor I think you ought to do it. I said, well, you know, I don't know that I can because I can't turn down a production. And he said, look, it's 1 day a week. You can pick the day and we'll be flexible with you. And said, okay, if you can do that. And he said, we'll try it for a third of a semester. What I didn't know is they were actually trying out 2 other professors. But at the end of the semester, they called me in and said, we'd like to offer you this position. And I told them the same thing. And they said, we'll work with you. And now it's 14 years later. So I love teaching because teaching is a great way to learn. Over the years, as I've built up my roster of guests, it's become even more fun. I have never lost my enthusiasm for it. I'm very appreciative of the wonderful guests that I've had in the past that I'll be having in the future. And then I kept getting told, you know, you ought to write a book. There's some great stuff that's said in the class. And because of my production background, I always recorded the class. So I had all of the audio transcribed, but I didn't know how to go about selling a book. And then again, serendipity, I met somebody who really liked the idea. She wanted me to meet her agent. I did. And I'm giving you the really short version of this. Approached a business publisher and they said, well, why would a business person care anything about creativity? That door shut. Then we went to self-help, which takes in psychology and creativity. And their response was, why would a creative person care anything about business? That door shut. Then went to Hachette, who is one of the 2 or 3 largest publishers in the world. And when I walked in with my agent, they said, we love this book. We haven't seen any other book that merges together creativity and business. And that's really great. So we're very excited about this. So that was a really nice welcome. And we had a terrific meeting. I ended up getting an offer and I was so excited that I sold the book. I forgot I actually had to write it. So that was the next challenge, was to write a book like this because I'd never done that before either, but I knew I could write. And I wanted to make it unique as opposed to just this person's interview, that person's interview, and so on. So the comments and wisdom that is shared by my guests is embedded also in my narrative about, you know, what my story and my journey has been. So I love teaching the class because I love learning along with the students. I have a great platform to attract really good guests. The book is a great benefit that has come of it. But I also just love engaging with people who are doing interesting things and being able to talk to them about what they do.
Not just really good guests, the best guests. I want to know how you get these people. I mean, and I want to say the extraordinary thing is that once you become friends with Jeff, that he invites you to come sit in on the class. So I've been able to go attend and hear from, you know, Damon John, the founder of FUBU, the founder of Foursquare. You've interviewed supermodel Carly Kloss, the editors of all the top magazines in New York. I mean, I'm always thinking, these students do not understand how extraordinary this access is. But how do you get, I mean, are these all friends of yours? Do you just kind of email people out of the blue? How do you get these guests?
I just knock on their door, and when they open the door, I do my pitch. Now, what I do is, when I have a guest, and I may have met that guest through a friend, I may have seen them on television and have reached out. You know, there's all kinds of ways, but as you begin to build a network, I will say, you know, do you have anyone else that you think that you could suggest for the class? And you meet good people through other good people. So that's another thing that starts happening, is once you start getting some momentum going, and you invite these people to say, oh, you know, I have somebody who would be great for you, you know, to come to the class. And so it's, as, what was her name? Blanche Dubois in Streetcar Named Desire. I depend on the kindness of strangers. Yeah. And so I ask people to help out, you know, with introductions. And most people are very willing to do that.
So the confessional question I've been dying to ask you is, who have some of your favorite guests? I know they're all your favorite, but who have some of your personal favorites been, or maybe some insights that really affected you personally, or things you didn't expect?
Well, it's not a cop-out to say that I don't have a favorite, because my favorite guest is always the person that I'm talking to that day. And I'm not saying that in any kind of a Pollyanna way, but it's true, because, you know, the best interviews, you know, and you and I have talked about this, is a conversation. And that's the best kind of interview. And so, you know, I might one week be talking to Michael Arad. Michael Arad designed the 9/11 memorial. And I said to the students before I even started the interview is, I want you to think about this for just a moment before we start. How many of you have seen like the Lincoln Memorial? You know, and some raise their hand. And how many of you have seen this landmark or that? And some raise their hands. I said, well, this is the first time, certainly in my life, and I would guess in yours, that you're going to get to talk to and hear from a person that has created a memorial that will be here long after we're all gone. So just think about that for a minute. That's pretty cool. And so Michael went into the story of not just the inspiration for the design and how he put the concept together, but the hellfire media storm that he had to face. And he was 27 when he got that contract.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was a competition like the Vietnam Wall Memorial.
I remember.
And so, you know, so there was the political things that he went through, the financial things that he went through, all of the different struggles that he had to go through to finally see this through its finish. So it was an amazing, amazing story. And then the next week I might be talking to Roy Wood Jr., who is very funny stand-up comedian, as I mentioned, but also what he has is tremendous insight into performance and how you have to edit a performance and how you have to do that. But then the next week I might be talking to Vanessa Friedman from the New York Times. She's the fashion critic, and Vanessa is really smart, and she puts fashion into a social context and popular cultural context. And then Suzanne Vega, who's a wonderful musician, and we'll talk about songwriting and singing, and it's on and on. So I don't have a favorite, because I'm so fortunate that I'm able to enlist a whole range of people, from Academy Award winners and Pulitzer Prize nominated journalists, photographers whose work you've seen, all this kind of thing. And so I honestly don't have a favorite, you know, because there are so many and I've gotten something from each one. And what I'll add to that as a validation for my equivocation on naming a favorite is, at the end of the semester, the students are to put together feedback on the guests, and they're supposed to list the top 3 that had the greatest impact on them. There has never in the 14 years been a unanimity that this person is the number 1. And I love the fact that there's always overlap, but there's such a spread of who resonated with who. And I really love that, because to me, that means I'm sort of curating this class correctly, because people are getting things from different aspects of the class. So I think that's pretty cool.
It's great. We have a question from our Zoom audience, and that is, what are your thoughts on how different it is for these grads starting out right now, the opportunities and challenges, versus maybe when you started out?
Well, it's certainly a different world, you know, and it's not just a different world because of COVID, which makes things a lot more difficult just in terms of social distancing and getting together with people. Any of us who are paying attention to the news know that tech companies like Google and Apple and Zoom and Facebook and Twitter are recording record profits. So, you know, Amazon has hugely profited during this time. So I'd say there's, you know, since I started my career first in fashion, the seismic changes has been, one, the internet. The internet wasn't a thing when I started in business. I had to learn all about it because, you know, I got into it very early in creating content for the internet and for my clients. But that was a whole new way of distributing programming. So certain ways of making money went away, because I used to do quite well because a client like Ralph Lauren or Victoria's Secret 10 times a year would order 1,800, 2,000, 2,500 tapes. And we'd have to send out tapes and send out, DVDs. Well, now it's just a download link, so there were those changes. In today's world with COVID, it puts many more restrictions on people because you can't get together, because so many people are facing the difficulty of unemployment, of looking to even change careers and all of that. The interesting thing, and we don't have the stats on COVID yet, but in good times and bad times, the number of successes and failures of new business ventures has stayed pretty consistent. Most fail, whether the times are good or bad, and few succeed, whether the times are good or bad. So it's highly competitive out there, but so far, nothing has changed the stats on what percentage succeeds and what percentage fails. Is that? Yep.
Something I worry about with today's grads versus even when I graduated from college in 2000, and you could still move to an expensive city and have a bohemian lifestyle and make a go of it and get a job waiting tables and still pay the bills, if you're willing to live a couple subway stops outside of the city. Of course, Williamsburg was cheap then, and now I probably couldn't even afford it. And I worry about, the debt that so many students are saddled with. I don't want, especially like the performing arts and the visual arts, those jobs where there is no entry-level job. You have to have a day job and then create. I don't want those things to become the realm of the wealthy and the people who have means to be in those places, or to afford to not have to work or to pay for college.
There's no question there are challenges, but I also think that another result is going to be, there's going to be a precipitous drop in office space prices. Because I think a lot of people discovered they don't need the size office they had, or maybe they don't need an office at all. And I also think that residential prices are going to drop because right now, and I think it'll take time to get out of this period, but it's less desirable to live in a crowded city for some. Not for me, but for some. Every era has its challenges, but this is unique because I don't think anybody living, with the exception of my Aunt Lil, who's 101. So she was born, but has no consciousness in terms of the Spanish flu, the influenza that happened in 1918. But I think that, there are unique challenges to this. There's no question about it. I wish I had answers.
Well, I do, one cause for optimism is that the internet has opened up, the opportunity to create without being in a creative center like New York or LA or San Francisco. People can put their work out on YouTube and maybe find ways to get traction where they couldn't before.
Yeah, but there's also, that's true, but there's also, where there's a lot more competition there too. Remember Justin Bieber started as a YouTube star,
right?
And there weren't that many of them then. Now there's a lot. There's a lot in the influencer world that have, parlayed Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat. So, everything becomes really competitive.
Well, I do want to encourage people to get the book because there's so much in here and we've barely scratched the surface, but I have to end with the questions you ask your guests, which we also ask at pregame, but how do you define success?
Success to me is the ability to say no without catastrophic financial circumstances.
How do you define failure?
Giving up.
And if you had one piece of advice for those who have yet to read the book, who are on their own creative career journey, what is the most important thing for them to know?
Know why you're doing what you're doing. Be clear about that. and make sure that you've got sufficient motivation and thick enough skin to persevere in your journey towards what it is you want to do.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Always a joy to talk to you.
Thank you.
Yes. And I will continue to spread the word about the book, and I'll let you know when I get this all edited.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too.
I spit it cold like lyrically I'm a problem. That's when the show starts.